The dust had not yet settled when Marshal Frank Shepard stepped his horse sideways and blocked the entire width of the entrance road into Caldwell, Kansas, his broad shoulders squared against the hot August sky of 1879, his badge catching the sun like a blade of fire. He did not reach for his gun. He did not need to. The three men who had ridden up behind Pearl Whitfield's wagon pulled their horses to a hard stop, leather creaking, animals snorting with the sudden check of momentum, and every single one of those men looked at the marshal and felt the particular cold that a truly dangerous man carries around him the way a thundercloud carries lightning. Pearl herself sat rigid on the wagon bench, her hands white-knuckled around the reins, and she did not turn around. She already knew what was behind her. She had been running from it for 11 days. One of the riders, a thick-necked man named Corbin Holt, leaned forward in his saddle. His voice was pleasant in the way that a knife is pleasant when it has not yet cut you. "Marshal," he said, "that woman is a fugitive from a legal warrant issued in Dodge City. We have every right to bring her back." Frank Shepard did not move his horse 1 inch. His eyes were gray, steady, the color of gunmetal in winter, and they were fixed on Corbin Holt with an expression that was not anger exactly, but something older and more certain than anger. "Show me the warrant," Frank said. Holt reached inside his coat and produced a folded paper. Frank did not reach for it. He looked at it from where he sat, and something shifted behind his eyes. "That warrant was sworn by Judge Aldrich Crane," Frank said. "That is correct," Holt said. "Judge Crane has been under federal investigation for corruption since April," Frank said. "Any warrant bearing his signature is currently suspended pending review by the circuit court. I received that notice 2 weeks ago by telegraph from Topeka. This woman rides through here unquestioned." Holt's face went through several colors. Behind him, his two companions exchanged a look. One of them had his hand near his holster, but Frank Shepard was the kind of man that even nervous, trigger-happy hired guns hesitated to draw on, because there was no flinch in him, not a single tremor of uncertainty, and men who have spent their lives reading other men's fear find themselves strangely helpless when they find none. "You are obstructing lawful," Holt began. "I am doing my job," Frank said, "which is more than I can say for the three of you. Ride back to Dodge City. Tell whoever sent you that Caldwell is not a place where corrupt warrants are honored. Tell them that if they want to pursue this matter, they can do it through the circuit court, and they can do it properly." He paused, and in that pause the whole world seemed to hold its breath. "Now," he said quietly, "before I find reasons to detain all three of you." They went. Not fast, not with any dignity, but they went, and the sound of their horses faded into the flat Kansas horizon like smoke disappearing, like a bad dream breaking apart in morning light. Pearl Whitfield sat on her wagon bench, and she did not move for a long moment. When she finally turned to look at the marshal who had just done an extraordinary thing, she found him already looking at her. His expression was not triumphant. It was not even particularly warm. It was careful, the way a man looks at something he does not yet understand but knows is important. "You can bring your wagon through, ma'am," he said. And Pearl, who had not cried in 11 days because she had not had the luxury of it, felt something crack open in her chest that was only partly relief. But to understand what happened next, and to understand what had quietly been happening inside both of them for the 3 weeks before that morning, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to when Pearl Whitfield first rode into Caldwell on a different kind of day, under entirely different circumstances, when Frank Shepard had no idea she existed, and Pearl Whitfield had no idea that a man like him could. It was the 15th of July, 1879, and the Kansas summer was conducting itself with its customary brutality. The prairie stretched flat and golden on every side of the town, the grass low and dry from the heat, the sky a hard enamel blue that offered no suggestion of mercy. Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail, the last significant settlement before the Indian Territory to the south, and it was a town that had seen enough of human nature to have formed a fairly complete opinion of it. Pearl arrived on horseback, not in a wagon that first day. She was riding a bay mare with a white blaze, and she rode well, the way people do when they have learned it from necessity rather than leisure. She wore a dark riding dress that had been good quality once and was still presentable, her dark hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, and she carried a leather satchel across one shoulder that clinked faintly when she moved, the sound of glass against glass, which was the sound of the medical instruments and tinctures she worked with, because Pearl Whitfield was a healer. Not a physician, because the world she lived in had not yet decided to let women be physicians, but a healer in the most practical sense of the word, trained by her father who had been a doctor in Cincinnati before the war took him to pieces in ways that could not be sutured. She had been in Caldwell for 40 minutes when she met Frank Shepard. She had been directed to the marshal's office because the woman at the boarding house where Pearl hoped to let a room had told her that a new business needed to register with the marshal's office, which was the local procedure. And Pearl had sighed the small private sigh of a woman who had learned that official procedures in frontier towns were often designed to give men in authority an opportunity to tell women their plans were inadvisable. The marshal's office was a modest building on the main street, wood frame, paint fading, but neat in the way that spoke of someone who cared about what the space said about them. Inside there were 2 desks, a locked gun cabinet, a map of the county pinned to one wall, and Frank Shepard. He was not what she had been expecting. She had been expecting someone like the marshals she had encountered in other towns, men who wore their authority like a costume and treated everyone who came through their door as either a threat or an inconvenience. Frank Shepard was 34 years old that summer, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been arranged by experience into something more interesting than handsome, a jaw that was strong without being aggressive, eyes that were intelligent without being cold, and hands that were calloused but precise in their movements. He was reading a document when she came in, and he looked up with the particular attentiveness of someone who actually looks at the person in front of them. "Marshal Shepard," Pearl said. "That's right," he said, and he stood up, which Pearl noted. Not all men stood when a woman entered the room. Many men did not consider it necessary when the woman was arriving on business rather than for social purposes. She explained her intentions. She had medical training, practical experience working with a traveling physician for several years, and she intended to establish herself in Caldwell as a healer, offering treatments for common ailments, midwifery, wound care, and basic surgery in cases where the nearest actual physician was unavailable. She had a letter of reference from Dr. Emmett Voss of Wichita, who had employed her and could speak to her competence. Frank listened. He did not interrupt. He did not assume. When she finished, he said, "How long have you been doing this work?" 7 years, Pearl said. "Have you had formal training or is it all practical?" "Both," she said. "My father was a doctor. He trained me from the time I was a girl. I also have practical experience in the field, which I would argue is worth more than most of what is taught in medical schools in the current era, since those schools tend to teach men to theorize about the body rather than to work on it." Something moved behind Frank Shepard's gray eyes. It might have been the beginning of a smile if it had gotten a little further. "I won't argue with that," he said. "I have seen the work of trained physicians in this territory, and I have seen the work of competent practical healers, and I know which one I would choose in an emergency." He looked at her letter of reference, then back at her. "I'll register your practice. You'll want to speak to the town council about a permanent space, but until then, you can work out of your boarding room if Mrs. Hannigan has no objection." "She said she would not," Pearl said. "Then you're settled," Frank said. There was a moment then, brief and unremarkable and somehow not unremarkable at all, where they simply looked at each other with the direct frankness of 2 people who have each, separately, learned not to waste time on performance. Then Pearl thanked him, took her registered paper, and left. And Frank Shepard sat back down at his desk and found that he was looking at the door for a moment after she had gone through it. Caldwell in the summer of 1879 was a town in the process of becoming something. The cattle drives were changing the territory, money and violence and industry moving through in roughly equal proportions, and a town at the edge of the trail was a town that needed everything at once. It needed order, and it needed medicine, and it needed people who were actually good at what they claimed to be. Pearl Whitfield turned out to be very good at what she claimed to be. Within a week of her arrival, she had treated a cowhand's infected leg wound that had been days from requiring amputation and saved the leg entirely, assisted in a difficult birth that had been frightening the local midwife, and correctly identified a case of typhoid in a family that had been attributing their illness to bad luck. The town noticed. Towns always notice competence when they need it badly enough. Frank noticed too, though he told himself it was professional. He told himself that it was simply the interest of a marshal who needed to know the capabilities of everyone in his town. He told himself this when he found himself taking a longer route past the room Pearl had converted into a treatment space. He told himself this when he discovered he was listening for her voice in the general noise of the street. He was a man who had been very honest with himself about most things for a long time, and the dishonesty of these particular self-explanations sat uneasily with him. But he let them stand for a while because some truths require a certain amount of preparation before you can look at them directly. They developed a habit without either of them planning it. Every evening around sundown, when the day's most urgent business had been seen to, Frank would come by whatever space Pearl was working in with 2 cups of coffee from the restaurant next to his office, and they would sit for 20 minutes or half an hour and talk. It had started because Pearl had been treating a deputy who had been thrown by a horse, and Frank had come to check on the deputy, and Pearl had offered him coffee because she had some, and the conversation had lasted 2 hours and left both of them looking at the evening with a kind of warmth they each found slightly surprising. After that first time it simply continued, the way things continue when they answer a need that neither person has fully admitted to having. They talked about everything and nothing. They talked about the territory, about the law, about the nature of medicine and the nature of justice, and the uncomfortable places where those 2 things intersected in a frontier town. They talked about politics, about the changes coming to Kansas, about the cattle trade and what it was doing to the land. They talked about books, because Frank read more than anyone in Caldwell suspected, and Pearl had been educated with the specific thoroughness of a doctor's daughter in a household where books were treated as necessary rather than decorative. What they did not talk about, for a long time, was the past that each of them carried. Frank Shepard had come to Caldwell 2 years before Pearl arrived. Before that he had been a deputy marshal in Abilene during the height of its wildest years, and before that he had been something else entirely, something he had put down like a weapon he no longer had use for, though the weight of it was still sometimes present in the way he held himself, in the particular quality of his watchfulness. He had been engaged once. A woman named Clara, who had been gentle and good and who had died of a fever when Frank was 28, and who had left behind in him a grief so clean and absolute that it had burned away, eventually, into something that was not quite grief anymore but was not quite peace either. He had not been close to love since then. He had not been particularly interested in being close to it. He had channeled every spare piece of himself into being good at his work, into being the kind of marshal who made a town genuinely safer rather than merely more orderly, and this had given his life a shape and a purpose that he had told himself was sufficient. Pearl Whitfield's past was darker than she let on, and darker than anyone in Caldwell knew. She had spent 3 years in Dodge City before coming to Caldwell. In Dodge City, she had worked as a healer under the protection of a man named Aldrich Crane, who had been at that time a respected citizen and minor official, before he had risen to the position of judge. What Pearl had known about Aldrich Crane that no one else in Dodge City had known, because Pearl had the particular misfortune of knowing things she had not gone looking for, was that Crane was connected to a network of men who ran a protection operation across 3 counties. They called it business. It was extortion, and occasionally it was worse than extortion. Pearl had learned this in the way that people learn the most dangerous things, which is by accident, by being in a place she was not expected to be, at a time she was not expected to be there, hearing a conversation that was not meant for her ears. She had been treating a man in Crane's house, a man who had been badly beaten and who turned out to have been beaten at Crane's order, and she had overheard enough to understand what she was inside of. She had not run immediately. Running immediately would have been dangerous, and Pearl was above all things a practical woman. She had continued working, continued being useful, continued being the unremarkable healer that powerful men do not pay attention to. And she had, slowly and carefully, over the course of 8 months, gathered evidence, documented injuries that told stories, copied names from papers she had access to in her capacity as a healer, built a record that she had sent in pieces to a federal marshal she had heard could be trusted, a man in Topeka named Harrison. When Crane had found out what she was doing, she had already sent the last piece of evidence. The federal investigation was already open, but she was also, suddenly, in terrible danger. She had left Dodge City on a night in July with nothing but her horse, her medical bag, her satchel of instruments, and the cold comprehension that Crane would use every official and unofficial mechanism available to him to have her brought back before she could testify. The warrant had been the official mechanism. Corbin Holt and his companions were the unofficial one. She had not told anyone in Caldwell any of this because she had not known, for the first 2 weeks, whether she was going to stay. She had not known whether Caldwell was going to be a place where the truth would be received as truth or as a problem to be managed. She had been in enough towns to know that the difference was not always obvious from the outside. But the evenings with Frank had changed something in her calculations, slowly. The way weather changes slowly until one morning you look out the window and realize the season has shifted while you were attending to other things. She had begun to feel the weight of the secret she was carrying in the specific way that you feel it when there is someone you want not to be keeping secrets from. Frank, for his part, was developing a problem. He was a man who had been committed for several years to the idea that what he felt toward Pearl Whitfield was professional regard and intellectual companionship, and nothing more inconvenient than that. This idea was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. It happened clearly, the way things sometimes do, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday in the 3rd week of July. A rider had come in from the south with a badly broken arm, the bone clean through the skin, the kind of injury that required immediate attention and a steady hand. Pearl had set the bone with a focused competence that was extraordinary to witness, her movements certain and efficient, and when she was done, when the man was white-faced but breathing and the arm was properly set and splinted, she had straightened up and pushed a strand of dark hair back from her forehead with the back of her wrist, because her hands were occupied, and she had looked across the room and found Frank watching her, and for one unguarded moment neither of them performed anything at all. What passed between them in that moment was not a word or a gesture. It was the simple, devastating acknowledgement of 2 people who have been careful not to see something and have suddenly, simultaneously, seen it. Then Pearl looked back at her patient and Frank looked at the middle distance, and they went on with the rest of the day as if nothing had shifted. But everything had shifted, in the way that ground shifts before an earthquake, the deep quiet restructuring of something that will express itself fully only later. 3 days after that, Pearl received a letter. She was sitting in her treatment room when it arrived, delivered by a boy from the postal office, and she read it and went very still. The letter was from the federal marshal in Topeka, Harrison, warning her that Crane's men had been traced south along the Kisham Trail and were believed to be heading toward Caldwell. Harrison wrote that the investigation was solid and her testimony would be critical, but that he needed 3 more weeks to properly secure the circuit court proceedings, and that she should stay in Caldwell if she safely could, and that he had communicated with the town marshal there, who had been given the details of the corrupt warrant and was aware of the situation. Pearl read the letter twice. Then she folded it and held it in her hands and thought about what it meant that Frank Shepard had known about the warrant and about the investigation and had not mentioned it to her. She went to his office that afternoon, not in the evening for their usual conversation, but in the afternoon when the sun was still brutal, and the street was quiet in the way that frontier streets are quiet during the worst heat of the day. Frank was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, and something crossed his face that was not surprise, but was perhaps the particular composure of a man who has been expecting a moment and is now experiencing it. "You knew," Pearl said. "Yes," he said. He did not qualify it or deflect it. "How long?" "I received the telegraph from Marshal Harrison 12 days ago," he said. "The day before you arrived." Pearl sat down in the chair across from his desk. She looked at him for a long moment with the gray, direct intelligence that was the most characteristic thing about her face. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. Frank was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of evasion, but the quiet of a man choosing his words because he respects the person he is speaking to. "Because if I had come to you on the second day and said that I knew who you were and why you were here, you would have left," he said. "And I did not want you to leave, for official reasons and for other reasons that are not official at all, which I am now aware is more complicated than it should be." The air in the office felt different after that, denser, more present. "Tell me the official reasons first," Pearl said. "The official reasons are that your testimony is the most important single element in building the case against Crane," Frank said. "Harrison needs you here. The investigation needs you here. There are people across 3 counties who have been living under Crane's operation for years who need you to testify." "And the unofficial reasons," Pearl said. Frank looked at her steadily. "You already know them," he said. She did. She had known them in the particular way that you know things you have been resisting knowing, and now that they were out in the open between them, they were both very clearly present and also very frightening. Because Pearl Whitfield had not let herself want things from particular people in a long time, and the experience of wanting something from Frank Shepard specifically was not comfortable in the way that most things that matter are not comfortable initially. "This is not the time for that conversation," she said. "No," Frank agreed, "it is not. Crane's men are coming," she said. "I know," Frank said. "And I intend for this to be a town they can ride into and ride back out of with nothing to show for it." They talked for another hour. Practical talk, strategic talk, the kind of conversation that Pearl had not been able to have with anyone else because there had not been anyone else who knew the full shape of what she was in. Frank had read Harrison's communication carefully. He understood the legal framework. He understood where Crane's operation was vulnerable and where it was still protected. He understood the timing, the 3-week window before the circuit court proceedings, and what it meant that Corbin Holt and his companions might arrive during that window. "You should stay in town," Frank said. "Don't ride out alone." "I have patients in the farm south of town," Pearl said. "I'll ride with you," Frank said, "or I'll send my deputy." "I don't need a minder," Pearl said, and there was a flash of something behind her eyes that was not quite irritation and not quite something else. "No," Frank said carefully. "You don't need a minder, but I would feel better if you were not alone on the road. That is a different thing." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. The days that followed were among the strangest of Pearl's life, which had already contained a fair number of strange days. She continued her work, the daily rounds of a healer in a frontier town, which were never simple and never the same twice. She treated a child with scarlet fever and sat up 2 nights in a row nursing the fever down with careful applications of cool water and white willow bark tea. The only things that worked, and the things that most so-called physicians still refused to credit. She assisted at another birth, this one uncomplicated, a healthy boy born to a cattle drover's wife, the woman's 3rd child and the easiest by her own account, and Pearl held the baby while the mother slept and thought about what it would mean to stay somewhere, to actually stay. Frank rode with her when she went south to the farms, and those rides became another thing between them, different from the evening conversations, which were intimate in an intellectual way. The rides were something more physical, more elemental, the two of them on horseback in the enormous Kansas landscape, the grasslands rolling and the sky doing what it does in that country, which is being so vast and so present that it makes everything underneath it feel both very small and very significant. They talked on those rides too, but differently. The large open space seemed to release something in both of them that the closed rooms of the town kept contained. It was on one of those rides, 5 days after Pearl had confronted Frank in his office, that Frank told her about Clara. He told her without particular drama, the way he did most things, directly and without ornamentation. He said that he had been engaged once, that her name had been Clara Briggs, that she had been 26 when she died and he had been 28, and that it had taken him a long time to find his way back from that to being a person who could properly inhabit his own life. "Is that why you came here?" Pearl asked. "To Caldwell, partly," he said. "I needed a place that needed the kind of marshal I could be. And I needed to be somewhere that the ghosts were not in every building." Pearl was quiet for a moment. The horses walked at an easy pace through the dry grass. "I understand that," she said. "I imagine you understand a number of things about needing to leave a place," Frank said carefully. "More than I would like," she said. "I have been moving for 3 years. Before Dodge City there was Wichita, and before Wichita there was Fort Worth, and before that there were other places. I have been good at leaving and very tired of being good at it." "Do you want to stop?" Frank said. She looked at him. The afternoon light was doing something very specific to his face, finding the serious lines of it, the quality of someone who says what he means, and Pearl felt the full weight of what was building between them with a clarity that was slightly breathtaking. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." Frank nodded. He did not say anything else immediately, but the quality of his silence was one of the things Pearl had come to trust, because it was never empty. When he said, after a while, "Caldwell has needed a proper healer for a long time," she understood everything that was inside that sentence and everything that was also beyond it. That night, sitting on the porch of Mrs. Hannigan's boarding house in the cooling air of the evening, with the stars coming out over the Kansas plain in their customary extravagance, Pearl wrote a letter to Marshal Harrison in Topeka. She told him she would stay. She told him she would testify. She folded the letter and held it in her hands and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. On the 8th day of August, Corbin Holt and his companions rode into view on the southern approach to Caldwell. Frank had been watching for them, not with anxiety, but with the focused readiness of a man who has prepared for something and is confident in his preparation. He had sent his deputy to ride the perimeter that morning, and when the deputy came back and said 3 riders from the south, Frank put on his hat, buckled his belt, checked that his colt was loaded, and rode out to the entrance road. Pearl heard about it afterward from Mrs. Hannigan, who had heard it from the blacksmith, who had watched from his doorway. Pearl herself was inside with a patient, a farmer named Greer who had come in with a deep gash on his forearm from a fence wire, and she was suturing the gash with the careful, even stitches she had learned from her father, when the sound of voices reached her from the street, and then the sound of horses departing, and then a great deal of very loud conversation from what sounded like half the town trying to recount what they had just witnessed. She sent the farmer home with instructions for cleaning the wound, and she went to the entrance road. Frank was still there when she reached him. He had not come into town yet. He was sitting on his horse at the place where the road entered Caldwell from the south, looking at the horizon where Holt and his men had gone, and when he heard Pearl come up behind him he turned around. She was not sure what she had intended to say. She had thought of several things on the way there and none of them had seemed adequate. What she said in the end was, "You knew they were coming this morning." "I had a fair expectation," Frank said. "You sent your deputy away," Pearl said. "My deputy is a good man," Frank said. But this was a situation that called for one clear voice. Two marshals sometimes create confusion about who is in charge. Pearl looked at him for a long moment. "You sent your deputy away so that you would be standing there alone," she said, "so that there would be no one with you." "I was not alone," Frank said. "The whole town was watching." "That is not the same thing as having someone next to you," Pearl said, and the intensity in her voice surprised her slightly, because she had not entirely known how frightened she had been until this moment when the danger had passed. Frank swung down off his horse. He was perhaps 6 feet from her in the late morning light, and he looked at her with those steady gray eyes that she had come to know as one of the most trustworthy things she had encountered in several years of trusting very little. "Pearl," he said. "Don't tell me you were not in danger," she said. "Holt is not a man who accepts setbacks easily. You knew that, and you stood there alone anyway." "I would do it again," Frank said simply. "I know you would," Pearl said. "That is what frightens me." The thing about Frank Shepard that was different from most men Pearl had known was that he did not mistake her fear for weakness. He looked at it for what it was, which was the particular terror of a person who has begun to care about someone and has had that person standing in the path of danger. "I did not intend to frighten you," he said. "I know that too," she said. They were standing very close now, the horses forgotten behind them, the town 100 yards away and conducting itself with its usual indifference to personal moments. "There is something I want to say to you," Frank said, "and I am aware that the timing is imperfect, because you are in the middle of a difficult and dangerous situation, and the next few weeks are going to require your full attention, and I do not want to add to the weight you are already carrying." "Say it anyway," Pearl said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing his words with the care he always brought to things that mattered. "I told you there were official reasons and unofficial reasons that I wanted you to stay in Caldwell," he said. "The official reasons are still true and they still matter, but the unofficial reasons have become considerably harder to maintain as unofficial. What I feel for you, Pearl, is not something I am good at packaging into something smaller than it is. It would be dishonest of me to try." She looked at him for a long time. The August heat lay over the prairie like something palpable, and the sky was the hard, brilliant blue of full summer, and Pearl Whitfield felt something happen in her chest that was enormous and also completely clear. "I'm not asking you for anything right now," Frank said. "I am only telling you because I think you deserve to know where I am standing." "I know where you are standing," Pearl said. "You are standing at the entrance to this town." Something shifted in his expression, subtle but real. "I meant that literally and otherwise," Pearl said. And then, because the moment was what it was, and because neither of them was a person who required extensive ceremony for the things that were true, she stepped forward and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers with a quiet sureness that felt, to Pearl, like the answer to a question she had been carrying for longer than she had realized. They stood like that for a moment at the edge of Caldwell, with the empty road stretching south behind them and the town waiting ahead, and it was not dramatic and it was not nothing. It was the beginning of something, and they both knew it, and they both held it carefully. The next 3 weeks were both the most difficult and the most quietly wonderful of Pearl's time in Caldwell, and that was a combination she had not previously experienced. The difficult part was the waiting, the uncertainty of the legal proceedings, the knowledge that Holt had not gone back to Dodge City simply because Frank had told him to but would be regrouping, reporting to Crane, likely devising something less direct and therefore more treacherous than a simple confrontation at the town entrance. The wonderful part was Frank. She had not expected him. She had not been looking for him. She had arrived in Caldwell as a woman who had made a kind of private peace with solitude, who had decided that her work was enough, and her independence was worth more than the complications that came with allowing someone close. Frank Shepard was disrupting this arrangement in the most thoroughgoing possible way, and the alarming thing was that she did not wish him to stop. He was not a man who crowded her. He seemed to understand instinctively that what Pearl needed was not to be pursued but to be met. And so he met her, directly and without pretense, and let her choose the pace of what was happening between them. He brought her coffee and gave her books he had finished and wanted her to read. He told her things about the town, its history, its people, the particular qualities of the land around it, with the enthusiasm of a man who has come to love a place and wants to share that love carefully rather than impose it. He asked her questions about her work that were intelligent questions, the kind that came from genuine curiosity rather than politeness, and he listened to her answers with the full quality of his attention, which was substantial. She told him about her father. She had not talked about her father to anyone in years. Dr. Lawrence Whitfield of Cincinnati, a man of extraordinary medical intelligence and also of extraordinary personal wreckage, because the war had done things to him that were not visible on the outside but had rearranged everything inside. He had drunk too much in his last years. He had been alternately the most present and the most absent father possible, sometimes teaching her medicine with the passionate precision of a man building something that would outlast him, and sometimes disappearing into himself for days at a time, and leaving Pearl to manage the household and wonder where she had lost him. "He died when I was 22, Pearl told Frank, on an evening when they were sitting on the porch of the marshal's office, the town quieting around them in the first cool of the night. And I was grief-stricken and also, I am ashamed to say, relieved. Not because I did not love him, but because watching someone you love damage themselves is its own particular kind of suffering. Grief is not required to be simple," Frank said. "No," Pearl said, "but it felt simple when I was young. When I was a girl, I thought that loving someone meant wanting them to be well, and wanting that badly enough was supposed to make them well. The war taught him otherwise, and his teaching trickled down to me eventually." Frank was quiet for a moment. "You have been taking care of people your whole life," he said. "It is what I know how to do," Pearl said. "That is true," Frank said, "but it is not the only thing true about you." She looked at him. "What else do you see?" she said. He thought about this with the seriousness she had come to expect from him. "I see someone who is very strong and very tired of having to be so strong alone," he said. "I see someone who is more honest than the world has generally rewarded her for being. I see someone who loves ideas and arguments and the specific pleasure of being genuinely useful, and who has been spending a great deal of energy pretending that is enough when what is actually enough is not something you can achieve alone." Pearl was quiet for a long time after that. The stars were extraordinary over the Kansas plain, an extravagance of light in the enormous dark sky, and the night insects were conducting their usual operations in the grass beyond the buildings, and Pearl Whitfield sat next to Frank Shepard and felt the precise sensation of being seen, which is not the same as being observed, and is much rarer. "You are a very unusual person," she said finally. "So I have been told," Frank said, and that time the smile actually arrived on his face, and Pearl discovered that it transformed him in a way she found thoroughly dangerous. The 12th of August brought a development that changed the texture of the situation. A rider came from Dodge City, not one of Holt's men but someone entirely different, a young man named Teller who worked as a clerk, and who was clearly frightened and clearly brave enough to be frightened and ride south anyway. He had a message for Pearl from a woman named Rosa, who had been one of the people Crane's men had extorted, whose husband had been beaten 3 years before for refusing to pay, and who had somehow gotten word that Pearl was still alive and safe and waiting. The message from Rosa was brief but important. 2 more witnesses had come forward. They had given statements to Marshal Harrison in Topeka. The case was stronger. And Crane, knowing this, was becoming desperate, which meant that the danger to Pearl had not decreased but had taken a different shape. Frank read the message with Pearl. "He will not come at you directly again," Frank said. Holt's approach failed and it created a public record of attempted interference. Crane will be more careful. "What does careful mean in his case?" Pearl said. "It means someone you trust," Frank said quietly. "It means someone who does not look like a threat." Pearl looked at him steadily. "I trust you," she said. "I know," he said, "and I will not break that." The simplicity of it was remarkable. No elaborate declaration, no dramatic protestation. Just the flat, factual certainty of a man who means what he says, and Pearl felt the truth of it in her bones. She told him, that night, all of it. Everything she had not told him before. All the pieces she had been holding back, partly from habit and partly from self-protection. She told him how she had come to be in Crane's orbit, how she had understood what she was seeing before she let herself admit she understood it, how she had spent 8 months quietly and terrifyingly gathering evidence while appearing to be nothing more than a useful and unambitious healer. She told him what she had seen done to Rose's husband, the specific nature of the violence, and she told him about the night she had ridden out of Dodge City in the dark on her bay mare with her hands shaking so badly she had nearly dropped the reins. Frank listened. He did not interrupt or interject or try to insert himself into the story. He simply listened with the full presence he brought to everything, and when she was done he said, "You are one of the bravest people I have ever known." "I am not," Pearl said. "I was afraid the entire time." "That is what brave means," Frank said. "Doing the thing anyway." Something moved through her when he said that, something warm and a little devastating. She had been called competent many times and useful many times and occasionally remarkable, but brave was different. Brave was about the inside of the thing rather than the external product of it, and Frank Shepard saw both. "I need you to know something," Pearl said. "When this is finished, when the testimony is given and the case is resolved, I do not know what I am going to do next. I have been moving for 3 years and I told you I was tired of it, and that is true. But I have learned to be careful about deciding where I belong before I know what belonging there looks like." "I understand that," Frank said. "I'm not saying I will leave," Pearl said. "I know," Frank said. "I am saying that I cannot make you any promises yet," she said. "Not because I do not want to, but because I have made promises before from a place of relief rather than genuine certainty, and they have not served me or anyone else well." Frank looked at her with the directness that was so characteristic of him. "Pearl," he said, "I am not asking you for promises. I am 34 years old and I have been in enough situations to know that promises made under pressure are worth considerably less than the actions of ordinary days. What I want from you is what we already have, which is something I consider extraordinarily valuable. Everything else can follow from that at whatever pace it follows." She looked at him for a long time. "How are you real?" she said, and she had not intended it to come out like that, with that quality of quiet wonder, but it did, and Frank made a small sound that was almost a laugh, and for a moment they were both slightly undone by it, which was a feeling that Pearl found she did not mind at all. The night of the 17th of August was the night that Crane made his careful move. It came through a man named Pierce, who arrived in Caldwell presenting himself as a land surveyor from Topeka, a pleasant, middle-aged man with a professional demeanor, and a letter of introduction that was very convincingly forged. He took a room at a different boarding house than Pearl's, set up his surveying equipment in a visible and credible fashion, and spent his first day in Caldwell establishing himself as exactly what he claimed to be. Frank noticed him. Frank noticed most things in Caldwell, because that was the nature of his particular gift, which was the ability to read a situation before it had fully expressed itself. Something about Pierce was not quite right in a way that Frank could not immediately name, but also could not dismiss. He mentioned it to Pearl on the evening of the 17th, casually, the way he mentioned most things that were concerning him, which was directly. "There is a new man in town," he said. "His name is Pierce, he says. I want you to be careful." Pearl nodded. She trusted Frank's instincts without needing to be shown their workings. What happened next happened very fast, which is how dangerous things tend to happen. Pierce had spent his second day making contacts in the town, and one of those contacts had been Mrs. Hannigan's husband, a genial and rather gullible man who managed the boarding house accounts while his wife ran everything else. Pierce had over a very congenial lunch at the restaurant, mentioned that he understood there was a healer in town, and had expressed admiration for the general quality of Caldwell's services, and had asked, with what seemed like idle curiosity, where she kept her treatment rooms. Hannigan told him. He had no reason not to. That evening, Pearl was in her treatment room later than usual. She was writing up her case notes, a practice her father had instilled in her, and that she maintained rigorously, because written records of treatments and outcomes were how medicine actually improved, in her view, rather than through the accumulated mythology of what was supposed to work. She was aware that it was getting late and that she should go back to the boarding house, but she was also in the particular productive flow of someone who has found their rhythm and does not want to break it. The sound at the back of the room was small, the kind of sound that you register without immediately understanding that you have registered it. Pearl had been alone in quiet rooms enough times to know the difference between building sounds and human sounds, and this was a human sound, and she was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand. Pierce was in the room with her. He had come through the back window, which Pearl had left open for the heat, which was something she would never do again. He was not holding a gun. He was holding a document which was in some ways more frightening. "Miss Whitfield," he said pleasantly, "I have a proposition for you." The proposition was exactly what she had expected and feared. Crane was willing to drop the warrant and drop the pursuit if Pearl would sign a retraction of her testimony, stating that the evidence she had provided had been fabricated out of personal animus against Judge Crane. It was not a legal document in any real sense, but it would muddy the proceedings enough to give Crane's lawyers something to work with. "You can take that document and put it in the fire," Pearl said. Pierce looked at her. The pleasantness left his face. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "Judge Crane is a man with a very long memory and considerable resources. Your Marshal friend is one man in one town. He cannot protect you from what Crane can bring to bear." "Get out of my room," Pearl said. "Be reasonable," Pierce said. He stepped forward. Frank came through the door. He had not been there, and then he was there, and the transition was so immediate and so complete that Pierce actually flinched back. Frank had his hand on his gun but had not drawn it, which was a specific choice, and Pierce registered the specific quality of Frank's presence in the same way that Holt's men had registered it at the town entrance, with the instinctive animal recognition of something fundamentally serious. "Step away from her," Frank said. "Marshal," Pierce said, "this is a private conversation." "It has ceased to be that," Frank said. "You entered this building through a window without invitation, which constitutes breaking and entering in the state of Kansas, and I heard enough of your conversation to add coercion and attempted obstruction of federal justice proceedings to that. You will come with me." Pierce looked at the gun Frank had not drawn, and then at Frank's eyes, and then made the calculation that most men made in Frank Shepard's presence, which was that the odds were not favorable. He was taken to the jail. He gave a different name in the morning, but the telegram to Marshal Harrison in Topeka produced, by the following evening, the information that Pierce was a man named Darrow who had done similar work for Crane on 2 previous occasions and was already wanted in connection with the federal investigation. Harrison wired that Darrow was exactly the corroborating evidence they had needed on the operational side of Crane's network, the evidence that showed the conspiracy in active operation rather than simply in historical record. The case was moving toward its resolution. Pearl stood in Frank's office that evening after Darrow had been secured and the telegrams had been sent, and she was aware that her hands were not quite steady, the aftermath of the evening's fear working its way out through her body, which she had learned was how the body handled terror after the fact, since it could not always handle it in the moment. Frank brought her coffee, which was becoming something of a private language between them, the offer of coffee meaning 100 specific and warm things that neither of them was required to articulate. She took it with both hands and felt the heat of the cup and breathed. "How did you know?" she asked. "To come." "I saw Hannigan at supper," Frank said. He mentioned that he had spoken with the surveyor about where your rooms were. Something about the way he said it, he stopped. I do not have a better explanation than that I knew. That is explanation enough, Pearl said. She looked at him across the small space of his office. This man she had not known existed 6 weeks ago, and who had become, in those 6 weeks, the most significant person in her daily life and the person she felt most like herself with. And she thought about what he had said to her about ordinary days being worth more than promises made under pressure. "Frank," she said. "Pearl," he said, and the way he said her name was a thing unto itself, a specific quality of voice that she had catalogued without meaning to from the first time he had said it, direct and warm and present. "I think I would like to stay in Caldwell," she said. He was very still for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Not because of Crane or because of the investigation," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, because I do. Not because I am tired, although I am. Because this is the first place in a very long time where I feel like I am not moving through, but arriving." Frank set down his own coffee cup with the slow deliberateness of a man managing something that wants to be much larger than the moment calls for. He crossed the space between them and took her face in his hands, those calloused, careful hands, and Pearl looked up at him and felt something complete itself in her that had been incomplete for longer than she could precisely account for. He kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything, which was full intention and no theatrics, and Pearl kissed him back with the particular relief of a woman who has stopped running and found something worth stopping for. They stood in the marshal's office of Caldwell, Kansas, on the 18th of August, 1879, with the night outside and the town around them, and what they were to each other became something new and clear, and without any of the secrecy that everything else in Pearl's recent life had required. The remaining weeks before the circuit court proceedings were busy in the best way, the way of people who have acknowledged something real between them and are now navigating it with both excitement and care. Pearl continued her work, because Pearl's work was Pearl's work, and that was not going to change. Frank continued his, because Caldwell still needed him and the territory still produced its daily share of situations requiring a man who was good at his particular job. They ate supper together most evenings. They walked sometimes in the cooler hours, along the edge of the town where the prairie began, and talked about everything with the freedom of people who have put down the performance of themselves and are simply present with each other. Frank was funny in a dry, understated way that Pearl found delightful, because she was sharp and quick, and she appreciated someone who could meet her there without trying to outperform her. She made him laugh, genuinely, the way that people who are very serious are sometimes made to laugh by people who understand precisely the right angle of absurdity to apply to a given situation. He told her about his years in Abilene, about the specific lawlessness of a cattle boomtown in its height, about men he had known who had been simultaneously very dangerous and very human, about the strange companionship that developed among people living at the edge of things. He told her about his family in Missouri, a mother who was still living, 2 brothers who were farming, a sister who had married a physician in St. Louis, and who Frank wrote to every few weeks in the specific way of someone who loves their family and lives at a significant distance from them. Pearl told him about her years of traveling, the different towns and different people, the extraordinary variety of the human body under stress and illness, the strange intimacy of being the person that people come to with their most physical fears. She told him about things that had gone wrong, treatments that had not worked, patients she had lost, which were the things that healers carry and that most people do not ask about because they assume that professional competence means the absence of grief over professional failures. Frank asked about them and listened to the answers and understood what they cost her. September came to the Kansas plains with its characteristic quality of beginning, the heat softening, the light shifting toward something more golden and less brutal, the grass turning as the season moved through it. The circuit court convened on the 4th of September in Topeka, and Pearl rode north with Frank and his deputy and Marshal Harrison, who had come down to personally escort the principal witness. Harrison was a careful, precise federal marshal in his mid-40s, with a soldier's bearing and a lawyer's mind, and he treated Pearl with the particular professional respect of a man who has spent months working with evidence that a woman gathered at considerable personal risk, and who is fully aware of what that risk had been. He shook her hand when they met and said that her work had built this case, and Pearl, who had not heard that said plainly by anyone in authority before, felt the acknowledgement land somewhere important. The proceedings took 4 days. Pearl testified for most of a full day, and it was the most precise and demanding thing she had done in a long time, because the defense lawyers for Crane were not incompetent, and they attempted every angle of discrediting that was available to them. They challenged her credentials. They suggested her evidence was fabricated. They implied that a woman traveling alone through the territory had motives that a jury should find suspicious. Pearl answered every question with the calm specificity that came from having told the truth to the best of her ability, which is the only thing that makes you genuinely unratable under examination, because you have nothing to keep track of except what actually happened. Frank sat in the gallery during her testimony. She did not look at him often, but she was aware of him there in the specific way that you are aware of the particular gravity of one person in a room, and it was steadying in a way she would tell him about later. Aldrich Crane was found guilty on 7 counts. The sentence was substantial. The operation he had run across 3 counties had involved extortion, fraud, the fabrication of legal documents, and conspiracy to obstruct federal justice, and the circuit court dealt with it accordingly. It was not a perfect resolution in the way that the world rarely produces perfect resolutions, because there were people who had suffered under Crane's operation for years and no verdict restored what they had lost, but it was real, and it was documented, and it was finished. Pearl walked out of the courthouse in Topeka on the afternoon of the 7th of September into the early autumn sunshine, and Frank was on the steps, and she went to him without breaking stride, and he put his arms around her, and she let herself be held for a long moment, just the feeling of it, the solid factual warmth of it, which was not weakness, and was not the end of her independence, but was something she had learned, slowly and with some difficulty, to understand as its own kind of strength. "It's done," she said. "It is," he said. They rode back to Caldwell the next morning, and the ride was different from all the previous rides, lighter in some essential way, the threat that had been running underneath everything else finally resolved and gone. The Kansas prairie received them with its usual vast impartiality, the sky in the particular blue of early autumn, the grass shifting in the wind that moved constantly across that flat land like something looking for something. "I want to ask you something," Frank said when they were perhaps halfway home. Pearl looked at him. The morning light was good on his face, finding the lines of it with the particular affection that autumn light in Kansas brings to things. "Then ask," she said. He was quiet for a moment, the considered quiet that meant he was choosing his words with care, and Pearl waited with the patience she had developed for the specific rhythm of him. "When I said I wanted you to stay in Caldwell," he said, "I was telling you the truth. And when you said you wanted to stay, I understood you to mean in the general sense, as a resident, as a healer, as someone who was choosing Caldwell as her place." "Yes," Pearl said. "I find that I want something more specific than that," Frank said. "I want to ask you if you would consider staying in Caldwell as my wife." The prairie received this question with its customary enormous silence. The wind moved through the grass. The horses walked. The sky was very blue. Pearl looked at Frank Shepard on horseback beside her in the early September light and thought about everything that had brought her to this road and everything that this road led to, and about what it meant to choose something from fullness rather than from necessity. "Yes," she said, "I will consider it." He looked at her. "That is not a yes," he said. "It is a very strong yes that wants to be asked again properly," Pearl said. "Not on horseback in the middle of nowhere." The sound that came out of Frank Shepard then was a full, genuine laugh, warm and surprised, and Pearl decided in that moment that making Frank Shepard laugh was one of her very favorite activities, and she intended to pursue it regularly for the foreseeable future. They were married in Caldwell on the 3rd of October, 1879. It was a small wedding by the standards of the era, which meant 30 people rather than 300, held in the Protestant church that Frank attended with the pragmatic inconsistency of a man who finds organized religion imperfect and God sufficiently plausible to make attendance occasionally worthwhile. Pearl wore a dress of deep blue wool that Mrs. Hannigan had helped her acquire from the dressmaker in Wichita, and she carried a small bunch of prairie wildflowers that Frank had ridden out at dawn to gather, and presented to her with an expression of such careful vulnerability that Pearl had kissed him for a full minute before she remembered they were supposed to be saving that for the ceremony. The reverend who officiated was a sensible man named Dorsey who had been in the territory for 20 years, and had long since revised his notion of what marriage ceremonies should contain to match the reality of the people entering them. He said the traditional words, and also said some things of his own about the nature of a partnership between two people who have each been tempered by difficult experience, and how such partnerships have a particular quality of gratitude and chosen commitment that is different from those formed in youth before the world has had its full effect on people. Frank made his vows with the direct seriousness of a man who understands the weight of a promise and makes them accordingly. Pearl made hers with a clarity that surprised her, because she had expected to feel something complicated at this moment, and instead felt something very simple, which was that she was choosing something true. The reception was at the restaurant that had become something of a community center in Caldwell, and there was good food and music from a fiddler and dancing, because a frontier town knows how to celebrate when it has something worth celebrating, and a marshal getting married to the woman who had healed half the town was absolutely something worth celebrating. Pearl danced with Frank with the particular pleasure of two people who have discovered in the course of other intimacies that they are well matched physically, and she danced with Harrison, who had come down from Topeka for the occasion, and Frank danced with Mrs. Hannigan, who was extremely satisfied with her role in the whole business. The winter of 1879 settled over the Kansas plains with a seriousness that the summer had promised it would, and Pearl and Frank's first winter together in the house that Frank had been slowly improving for 2 years, in the anticipation of something he had not let himself name, was the kind of winter that you remember not for its hardships, but for its interior quality, the long dark evenings with firelight and books and conversation, the specific knowledge of being in the right place with the right person, which is something that people who have spent time in the wrong places and the wrong relationships understand as the extraordinary thing it actually is. Pearl's practice grew through the winter because winter in frontier Kansas was relentless in producing the need for medical attention. She treated frostbite and influenza and broken bones from the ice, and she continued the work she had been doing with the farms south of town, now riding with Frank sometimes, and sometimes with a horse and route she knew well enough to make without escort. She was building a reputation across the county, not just as a healer but as a specific kind of healer who combined the scientific rigor her father had instilled with the patient attention to the whole person that she had developed through years of practical work. In the spring, a letter came from the medical college in Topeka, a response to an inquiry Pearl had sent during the winter. The college did not admit women as full medical students, which was the answer she had expected and had thought she was prepared for. Frank watched her read the letter and set it down and be quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What would you need to do what you do better?" She looked at him. "More education," she said. "Specifically in surgical technique and in the new approaches to infectious disease coming out of Europe, Lister's work, Koch's recent findings." "Then you will get it," Frank said. "The nearest institution that would train me as a woman is Incent." Louis, Pearl said. I have a sister in St. Louis, Frank said. She and her husband have the space. You could spend the months between spring planting and winter with them. She looked at him for a long time. You would be all right here alone, she said. I would be considerably less than all right, Frank said, but I would be proud of you for every day of it. Pearl went to St. Louis that summer, 1880, for 3 months, where she worked with a female physician named Dr. Amelia Stern, who had trained in Europe, and who taught Pearl more in 3 months than she had learned in the 3 years before them. It was exhilarating and exhausting, and Pearl wrote to Frank every 3 days with the careful specificity of someone who has learned that the quality of communication across distance matters as much as the frequency. Frank wrote back with a consistency and a warmth that made Pearl, reading his letters in Dr. Stern's spare room in St. Louis, feel the full specific weight of what she had gone home to waiting for her. She came back to Caldwell in October, and Frank was waiting at the edge of town. Not at the entrance road this time, but at the point where the northern road met the town's first buildings, his horse and her bay mare both tied to a post, and when she came down from the stage he was simply there, and the reunion had the quality of all things that matter, which is that it was both exactly as expected and entirely unlike what words could contain. By the spring of 1881, Pearl knew she was expecting a child. She told Frank on a morning in April when the prairie was doing the extraordinary thing it does every spring, when the winter flat grasslands suddenly come alive with color and movement, the early wildflowers coming up through the returning grass, and the sky full of migrating birds, the whole enormous landscape involved in a kind of resurrection that Pearl found genuinely moving every year. Frank's expression when she told him was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He did not say anything for a moment. He sat very still at the breakfast table with his coffee in his hands, and his gray eyes doing something she had not seen in them before, which was the full, unguarded quality of someone to whom something genuinely good is happening. Then he set down the coffee very carefully and took her hands in his and said, in a voice that was quieter than usual, "Pearl." "Yes," she said. "I am very, very glad," he said. Their son was born in November of 1881, and they named him Lawrence, for Pearl's father, which was a thing Frank had suggested, and Pearl had received with a gratitude that moved her considerably. Lawrence Shepard came into the world with the uncomplicated vigor of a healthy baby, and Pearl, who had attended dozens of births, was entirely unprepared for what it felt like to be on the other side of it, which was everything at once and nothing she could have predicted. Frank was present for the birth, which was unusual for the time. The midwife, a woman named Vera who had worked with Pearl on more than a dozen deliveries, had raised an eyebrow when Frank had settled himself in the chair in the corner and showed no intention of leaving. "This is not customary," Vera said. "It is not," Frank agreed. "And I am staying." When Lawrence arrived and was placed in his arms for the first time, Frank stood very still and looked at his son with the same quality of steady gray attention he brought to the most important things, and then he looked at Pearl with an expression that contained more than any previous conversation between them and also somehow simplified everything. "He looks like you," Frank said. "He looks like a baby," Pearl said exhaustedly. "A very handsome baby," Frank said. Caldwell grew through the early 1880s, as towns along the Kishom Trail grew with the cattle trade's boom years. Frank's reputation grew with the town, the particular reputation of a marshal who kept order without brutality and administered justice without corruption, which was rare enough in the territory that people noticed and said so. He was approached in 1882 about standing for election to the county sheriff position, which would have been a significant advancement, and he discussed it with Pearl at considerable length over many evenings. "Do you want it?" she asked. "Parts of it," he said. "The reach would be useful, the politics would not." "You are good at politics," Pearl said. "I am functional at politics," Frank said. "That is different. I am good at being a marshal." "Then be what you are good at," Pearl said. He did not run for sheriff. He stayed in Caldwell, which was what he had chosen from the beginning, and what continued to be the right choice in his estimation, because Caldwell was where Pearl's practice was, and where Lawrence was growing up, and where the particular life they had built together was rooted. Pearl's practice in those years became something she had not quite expected when she had arrived in Caldwell, as a woman, running from a corrupt judge with her medical bag and her bay mare. She had become, through the steady accumulation of competence and reputation, and the particular trust that comes from being genuinely useful to people in their most vulnerable moments, the closest thing to an actual physician that the county had. She had a proper space now, 2 rooms in a building on the main street that Frank had negotiated for her lease on when the previous tenant moved east, with an examination table and a cabinet for her instruments, and a small library of medical texts that she had been building for years. Dr. Stern from St. Louis came through Caldwell in 1883 and spent a week working with Pearl, and said afterward that Pearl's practical diagnostic skill was as good as anything she had seen in formally trained physicians, and the 2 women maintained a correspondence that was both professional and personal for years after. The letter from Dr. Stern was something Pearl kept in her desk and occasionally reread, not for reassurance, but for the specific pleasure of being recognized by someone who understood what the recognition meant. Lawrence grew into a boy of cheerful stubbornness and considerable curiosity, his father's watchfulness combined with his mother's precision, in a combination that produced a child who noticed everything and wanted to understand all of it. He was 3 when his sister arrived, a girl they named Clara, for Frank's first love, which was Pearl's suggestion, because Pearl had long understood that Clara was not a threat to what she and Frank had, but a part of Frank's history that deserved acknowledgement rather than erasure. Frank had received this suggestion with a silence that lasted several seconds, and then said that Pearl was a remarkable person, which she accepted as the significant statement it was. The years of the 1880s in Caldwell had their difficulties, because that was the nature of life in that time and place. There were the cattle trade's boom and its bust, the shift in the economy that came when the ranches moved further south and the trail traffic thinned. There was a hard winter in 1885 that killed livestock and tested everyone in the territory. There was an outbreak of diphtheria in the spring of 1886 that Pearl fought for 3 weeks with everything she had, saving most of her patients and losing 3, including a child of 7 whose death she carried in the specific way that healers carry their losses, quietly and permanently. Frank held her the night after the child died and did not say that it was not her fault, because Pearl did not need to be told that, and he did not say that she had done everything possible, because she knew that too. He simply held her and was present, and Pearl cried with the full force of the grief she had been holding professional competence over for 3 weeks, and Frank Shepard was the specific person in the specific place for that, which was everything it needed to be. They had their 3rd child in 1887, another boy named James, who arrived with an enthusiasm for noise and motion that distinguished him immediately from the contemplative Lawrence and the quietly determined Clara, and who kept Pearl and Frank and both older children in a state of affectionate exhaustion for his first several years of life. The question of Pearl's credentials came up again in 1887, when a newly arrived male physician set up practice in Caldwell. His name was Dr. Peters, a young man of 28 who had graduated from a medical college in Philadelphia, and he arrived with the particular confidence of someone who has received formal education and assumed it supersedes all other forms of knowledge. His first week in Caldwell he let it be known, in the specific quiet way that these things are communicated in small towns, that he considered Pearl's practice medically questionable, and that the community should understand there was now a proper physician available. Pearl heard this and set it aside. She had been setting aside similar things for her entire professional life. What she had not previously had was Frank Shepard, who had also heard it and who came to his office that evening with a particular quality of controlled irritation, "I am going to speak with him," Frank said. "You will do no such thing," Pearl said. Frank looked at her. "He is undermining your practice." "He is a young man who is frightened," Pearl said. "He has come to a town where the healer everyone knows and trusts is a woman with no formal degree, and that is threatening to everything his education told him about the order of things. Give him time." "Time," Frank said. "Time," Pearl confirmed. "And if he is any good at his work, which is what actually matters, he will understand eventually that we are not competition but complement. There are enough sick people in this county for 20 physicians and 20 healers." She was right, which was something Frank had long since become accustomed to without entirely losing the particular quality of being freshly impressed by it. Within 6 months, Pearl and Dr. Peters had developed a working relationship that benefited everyone in the county, with Peters handling the cases that required formal credentials and hospital referrals, and Pearl handling everything from routine care to the complex practical cases that 20 years of experience equipped her for in ways that Peters' training would take years to match. Peters, to his credit, recognized this. He told her so one afternoon in the plain-spoken way of someone revising a mistaken assumption, and Pearl respected him more for it. By 1890, Caldwell was a different town than the one Pearl had ridden into in the summer of 1879. The wild years of the cattle trail were giving way to something more settled, more permanent, the kind of community that builds schools and churches and debates civic improvements, that plants trees knowing they will be grown by the time children now young are grown themselves. Frank was still the marshal, deeply embedded in the fabric of the place, known and trusted in the way that a man becomes known and trusted when he has spent years doing his work honestly and with genuine care for the people he serves. Pearl's practice had its own deep roots. She had delivered a generation of Caldwell children, had been present at the deaths of people who had been strangers when she arrived, and who she mourned as the known and loved. She had trained 2 women in the basic skills of nursing and emergency care, because one of the things she had always understood was that the point was not to be necessary but to make others capable, and the county was better served by spreading competence than by concentrating it. On a Sunday afternoon in October of 1890, the 11th anniversary of their wedding, Frank and Pearl rode out onto the prairie west of Caldwell in the way they still sometimes did when the children were occupied and the day permitted. The sky was the deep autumn blue of the Kansas plains, the grass gone to its winter gold and the air carrying the particular sharpness of October that Pearl had come to associate with everything good, because October in Kansas was when she had married Frank and October in Kansas was when she always felt most fully arrived. They stopped on a small rise that gave a view of the whole surrounding country, the flat immensity of it, the town small and human-scaled in the east with its cluster of buildings and trees, the prairie enormous and indifferent in every other direction, the kind of landscape that either diminishes people or shows them clearly for what they are. Pearl looked at the view and then at Frank, who was looking at the view with the particular quality of a man who is also looking at something else, something interior. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I was thinking about the entrance road," Frank said, "the morning with Holt." "Why?" she said. "Because I have thought about it occasionally over the years," he said. "About what it would have been like if that morning had gone differently, if you had not come through, if I had been a different kind of man." "You are not a different kind of man," Pearl said. "No," he said, "but it is the kind of thing that makes you aware of the narrowness of the path, how much depends on very small things. A telegraph that arrived 2 weeks before instead of after, a letter of reference from Emmett Voss, a habit of coffee in the evenings." Pearl looked at him with the full attention she had been giving him for 11 years, the kind of attention that knows every inflection and every silence, the attention of a person who has been truly paying attention to someone for a long time. "Are you well?" she said, because she was also a healer and she noticed everything. "I am," he said. "I am very well, Pearl. I am looking at everything I have and finding it extraordinary, which is not a complaint." She moved her horse close to his and took his hand, the calloused hand that she had been holding for 11 years, and that still felt like something she had chosen rather than something she had simply come to inhabit. "It is extraordinary," she said. "It has always been extraordinary. You standing at that road was the beginning of everything." Frank looked at her with those gray eyes that she had spent 11 years reading, and that still, on certain afternoons in the October light, showed her something new. "She rides through here unquestioned," he said softly, and it had the quality of something that had moved from an act into a legend, from a moment into a meaning. "She rode through," Pearl said, "and she found what she was not looking for." "What was that?" he said, though he knew. "Home," she said. "And you?" He brought her hand up and kissed it in the old-fashioned way that he had, and Pearl felt the warmth of it move through her with the particular quality of something that has had 11 years to settle into its full depth and has not diminished by a single degree. They rode back to Caldwell in the long light of the October afternoon, back to the town that was hers as much as it was his, back to the house where Lawrence at 9 and Clara at 7, and James at 3 were being supervised by Mrs. Hannigan with the cheerful authority of a woman who had been invested in this family since before it was fully a family. The evening star was coming out over the prairie when they came in from the west, and the town was lit with lamplight in the windows, warm and particular in the cooling dark. Lawrence had been reading, and he put his book aside when his parents came through the door and asked Frank a question about one of the legal cases he had heard discussed in the way that children who live in the house of a thoughtful person absorb the substance of their thinking. Frank sat down and answered the question seriously, the way he answered all of Lawrence's questions, and Pearl stood in the doorway between the parlor and the kitchen and watched her husband and her son in the lamplight, and felt the full, quiet, extraordinary weight of what a life becomes when it is built well. She thought of the woman she had been 11 years ago, riding into Caldwell on a summer afternoon with her medical bag and her secrets, and her carefully maintained certainty that she did not need anything beyond her work. She thought of Frank standing at the entrance to the town, blocking the road with the particular seriousness of a man who has decided that something matters and is not going to be moved on it. She had ridden through unquestioned. And in the years since, she had been questioned in all the ways that mattered, the good questions, the questions asked between two people who are trying to understand each other and the world and their place in it. And she had asked the same questions back, and the answers had built everything around her, this house, these children, this town, this life. Frank looked up from his conversation with Lawrence and found Pearl watching him, and his expression was the one she liked best, which was the one that was not performing anything at all, just the simple, factual warmth of a man who is glad to see the person he loves. She went to him, because she always did, and sat beside him, and Lawrence, with the pragmatic acceptance of a 9-year-old who has been watching his parents be in love his whole life, simply moved over to make room and went back to his question. And the evening came down over Caldwell, Kansas, over the golden October prairie, over the house of the marshal and the healer who had found each other at the edge of the road and had not let go. Outside, the entrance road where it had all begun stretched south through the darkening grasslands, empty and quiet, just a road through the Kansas plain, carrying nothing now but the memory of a morning when a fierce and certain man had planted himself at its edge and changed the direction of everything with 4 words and the absolute seriousness of someone who had already decided. Pearl Whitfield had ridden through. Frank Shepard had made sure of it. And everything that mattered in either of their lives had grown from that one moment of a man choosing to stand firm, to be immovable, to use every piece of his authority and his knowledge, and his will to make a passage safe for one specific woman who was worth making it safe for. It was not the end of danger, because life in the West was not that, and life anywhere is not entirely that. But it was the beginning of everything that made the danger bearable and the ordinary days extraordinary, and the future something to lean toward rather than run from. In the years that followed, Pearl and Frank would tell the story of that morning sometimes, the way the long stories get told, in pieces and on particular evenings, with the children listening and later with Lawrence grown, and working as a lawyer in Wichita and Clara training in nursing in Kansas City and James still at home and as loud and enthusiastic as ever. And the town changed around them in the way of all living things, and they changed with it, and in it and through it. And when people asked Pearl when she had known, when she had understood what Frank Shepard was going to be to her, she always said the same thing. When he stopped those men, she said, not with a gun but with the law and with the certain knowledge of who he was, I understood that he was someone whose certainty was honest and whose strength was not about force, but about something else entirely. And when he brought me coffee afterward and did not make a great deal of what he had done, I understood that he was someone I wanted to know for the rest of my life. And Frank, who was always nearby when this story was being told because he had a habit of being nearby, would say that what he had done that morning was simply his job, which was the kind of thing very capable people say about the best things they do. And Pearl would look at him with the look she had developed over the years that contained everything that could not be said efficiently. And Frank would receive it the way he always received things that were true, which was with the full and steady attention of a man who understood what he had. The entrance road into Caldwell, Kansas, in the year 1879, on a hot August morning, had been a small geography to make a large decision. A marshal on horseback, a woman in a wagon, 3 men with a corrupt warrant and no genuine authority. And the moment when one person had decided, completely and without reservation, that this woman would pass through unquestioned, it had been justice, it had been protection, it had been the beginning of love. And all 3 of those things, in the life they built together in the years that followed, proved to be the same thing worn in different faces, the same essential commitment to the truth of the people in front of you, to seeing clearly, and to standing firm at the edge of whatever road needs standing firm at, because some things are worth being immovable for, and some people are worth every act of courage that their presence in your life requires. Pearl Whitfield, who became Pearl Shepard on the 3rd of October 1879, and who practiced as a healer in Caldwell, Kansas for 30 years, and who was eventually recognized by the State Medical Board in 1893, as a licensed practitioner when the regulations finally caught up with the reality of what women like her had been doing for decades, never forgot what it had felt like to drive that wagon through the entrance of a town that had not yet decided what it thought of her, with a fierce-eyed marshal clearing her path with nothing but his presence and his word. And Frank Shepard, who was Marshal of Caldwell for 16 years and who remained, after his years of service, a man the town considered its own in the most permanent sense, never forgot what he had felt when he had turned and found Pearl looking at him from her wagon, with eyes that were frightened and grateful and entirely themselves, the eyes of a woman who had been running and was ready, if only the place proved worthy of it, to stop. The place had proven worthy. They both had. And the October afternoons on the Kansas prairie, and the lamplight evenings in the house on the main street of Caldwell, and the 3 children and the years of ordinary extraordinary days were the evidence of it, permanent and unquestionable and free.